Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie, and today we'll be talking about 10 rookie mistakes that you can make when you're making your homebrew. So just to let you know, I'm a rookie myself. I've been doing this, it hasn't been many years yet, and I have many things to learn still. And I'm sure a lot of you watching have a lot more experience than I do. However, these are 10 things that I've done in the first few months of me making rum, and I'd like to share my experience with you so you can avoid these mistakes and so other people can avoid these simple mistakes that you don't necessarily always think of. Rookie mistake number one is not closing the lid tight enough. So I've made a jar and I've added the water, the yeast, the molasses. I've added everything you needed, and the inside was bubbling. So we had the foam, everything seemed good. However, nothing reflected in the airlock. The airlock was stagnant. The water wasn't bubbling at all, and I just found it weird. I knew that it was not a stuck fermentation, that it wasn't a fermentation that had never started, because inside the jar was showing activity. However, the airlock wasn't. And I soon noticed that it was just the lid that wasn't screwed on tight enough. Once that was adjusted, then the airlock started bubbling as usual. And that's one of the solutions that you can have so you don't have to restart everything. So sometimes what you did was good. It's just that there's a little there might be just a little element missing, and you don't necessarily have to start your whole process again. The second rookie mistake that I can tell you is that I've judged a batch based on its clearness. So I've thrown batches that are too opaque. I told myself it doesn't look like rum that is drinkable because it's too foggy. And I've had some clear washes that I've tasted thinking that it would be great, but it was disgusting. So you want to make sure that you taste everything before throwing it away, because if it's too foggy, there's always a way to fix it by either cold crashing, which is putting it in the fridge. You can add elements like turbo clear, bentonite. You can just play the waiting game, let gravity do its thing, and you don't have to throw away the batch if it's not how you like it at first. You can always adjust it. The third rookie mistake that I've made is misusing the hydrometer. So it's always important to use it at the beginning and at the end of every wash. At the beginning to calculate your starting gravity, at the end to calculate your final gravity, and with those two information, you can calculate the percentage of alcohol that you'll obtain. However, how do you do if you add sugar midway, or if you add sugar at the end? Then it starts getting complicated. And I've done a wash where my fermentation was done and I calculated my alcohol percentage. However, I decided either to back sweeten it or add more alcohol by adding sugar into the jar. And I couldn't tell people what the final percentage was because I didn't know. I didn't use a hydrometer at the end. So I told them it was roughly between 12 and 20% because that's how much alcohol the yeast yielded to. So a solution for this is to calculate your ABV at the beginning, so your alcohol by volume. You could do this by calculating your starting gravity, final gravity. So your final gravity should end once the wash is roughly from 0.990 to 0.990. And you calculate your alcohol percentage. Let's say, for simplicity reasons, it's at 12%. And then you add sugar. Once you add sugar, your final gravity will go back up. So from 0.980 to 0.990 to, let's say, 1.08. So you have to calculate that hydrometer reading the second time you're fermenting and the second time it ends. And once you get that final number and you do your calculations, so let's say your second reading is at 5%. And once you've done both readings, you can add your initial 12% to your 5%, and then you get 17%. And if you've had easier ways to calculate your ABV once you add sugar midway or at the end, that'd be really helpful because it's something that I believe could help the community. A fourth rookie mistake that I've done is chopping fruits and putting them in the jar once the rum is fermenting. So more specifically, I added lemon, which as you may know is very acid. So once I put lemon in, I even squeezed a little lemon by following the Buccaneer Bob's rum recipe. And this destroyed my pH. So instead of being at 5.2 at optimal levels, my pH dropped down to around 2.2. And in order for me to bring it back up, I needed to add either baking soda, calcium carbonate, and it was just a hassle. So a solution for this would maybe be to, instead of putting the fruit inside the wash, maybe just hanging it above the liquid. So in the jar, you can have maybe your liquid finishing here and your fruit, your lemon, let's say, just imparting its flavors within the jar during fermentation. A fifth rookie mistake that I've made in the past was leaving my jar for fermentation in a cold, dark kitchen. So you don't want to leave it in a place that's too cold, because the yeast just becomes dormant and it does nothing. So it's just there. You think you're producing alcohol, but it's just empty days where the yeast is just sleeping, basically. You want to make sure it's at a warmer level, so roughly 22 to 27 degrees Celsius, so the yeast gets activated and it can actually start eating sugar or other dead yeast, because it's cannibalistic. On the opposite spectrum of this, another rookie mistake is throwing the yeast in while the wash was too hot. So you're excited, you've put your molasses, sugar, water in the pan, and you put it in the jar for it to ferment, and right away you pitch in the yeast. But if it's too hot, it might kill off the yeast. So you want to just wait a bit, wait till the temperature cools down. Once it's at optimal levels, then you can pitch the yeast in. Depending on the yeast, it's going to tell you in the package what's the optimal temperature for you to pitch the yeast in. So different yeast have different characteristics and different requirements for temperature. A seventh rookie mistake is relying on your digital pH meter. So don't get me wrong, some people are fine with this and they use it perfectly. However, in my case, it was not, that's not how it went. I didn't buy one, but I had to buy 2 pH meters. The first one couldn't get it to work. I had to return it. And the second one of my batches that I talked about earlier, I've added lemon to the jar and I put my digital pH meter in and it gave me 2.2 for the pH levels. So what I had to do is add baking soda in order to increase this 2.2 to 5.2, which is the optimal pH level. And I blame the pH hydrometer. It could be me. However, in order for me to reach 5.2, I had to add about half the box of baking soda. So that seems a little intense. I don't think you're supposed to add that much. I just kept waiting for the pH meter to reach 5.2 and it just wasn't reaching that level. It only reached it once half the baking soda box was over. And let me know in the comments below how much baking soda you use, because this doesn't seem normal to add that much baking soda into your rum wash. Something I would add instead would be calcium carbonate, because adding this much baking soda actually gave it a bitter aftertaste. It gave off flavors by adding too much baking soda, and I would not do this again. Actually, I would just try to avoid putting any fruits in my wash again, just to not affect the pH. I'm just scared to touch it in any way. I'd rather just add extracts at the end for flavoring. Speaking of flavoring, the 8th rookie mistake that I've done was using powder to flavor. So powder is fine. It gives you the flavors that you want. However, you'll see little particles floating on top of your rum, which is not ideal. If you want your flavors to blend in with your rum, it's best to use extracts. It's liquid and no one's gonna know that you've added something in your wash to flavor it. However, the taste will be there. And you need less extracts than powder usually, because extracts are more potent. The 9th rookie mistake that I've made is treating all yeasts equal. So at the beginning, actually my first, I would say 2-3 batches of rum, I've used turbo yeast, and as many rookies do, I believe a lot of people start with turbo yeast because it's fast and popular. I've used turbo yeast, which includes yeast nutrients in the package. So once I've added the turbo yeast, I started seeing bubbling right away during the first day, or at latest in 24 hours. The only thing that's wrong with turbo yeast is that it yields off flavors. So I just wanted to try something new, and instead of using turbo yeast, I've switched to EC 1118 and daddy yeast. However, I assumed that it was as strong, you could say, as turbo yeast, so I did not add any yeast nutrients. Without adding yeast nutrients, the yeast were not able to start getting activated. So one thing I would suggest is, if you're not using turbo yeast, it's always best to add yeast nutrients and to keep your wash at higher temperature levels, because turbo yeast, even if it has off flavors, it's an easy yeast to use in the sense that there's not much complications that you can have at the beginning. So the only off things really are the flavors. with turbo yeast. With the other yeast that I've used, so the EC1118 and daddy yeast, what I've done is hydrate it beforehand. So I didn't have to do this with the turbo yeast either, but with these other types of yeast, what I do is that I put a little bit of the rum wash in a certain container, and then I put the yeast in, and I let it marinate for a bit to let it just get tingling and activated. And once it's active, I wait a few minutes, I drop it in the jar with the rest of the rum. Let me know when you hydrate your yeast, how long do you leave it for? I usually leave it for a few minutes. I have a feeling I'm not leaving it for long enough. So if you have tips on that, it would help the community. And if you could drop them below, that would be great. And the 10th rookie mistake that I've made is having off proportions. So my first batch, it was a disaster. Everything was overflowing. I initially planned on using 1 pan in order to dilute my sugar. I ended up using 2 pans because of all the extra water that I had to use. Everything was spilling everywhere. It wasn't ideal. And proportions also apply to sugar in this case. So I added too much sugar, so much sugar that the hydrometer floated so high that it was below the lowest number. It was like in the transparent part. It was no longer in the metric part of the hydrometer. And that's why I had to add more water. And by adding more water, instead of having 1 pan, I had to contain my wash in 2 pans, which was not ideal. So you want to make sure that there's enough water for the yeast to thrive. So make sure there's not too much sugar. And I personally believe that I was adding too much turbo yeast. So I say this because now that I use the EC1118 and the daddy yeast, the recommended proportions are 1 teaspoon per gallon. So it's not that much. And when I was using turbo yeast, I would use 45 grams per gallon. So it's exponentially more. Maybe that's why it was bubbling so quickly at the beginning, but you don't need this much yeast. It's always best to have more yeast than not enough. However, it's a waste. I mean, if you want to keep your yeast for long, just use the recommended amounts, because anyways, yeast multiply. So it might not seem like a lot, 1 teaspoon per gallon, but don't worry, they thrive in this environment and they can take care of the job. It's also good to note that yeast eat dead yeast. So they're cannibalistic and they always find a way to survive. You don't have to worry about them much. You just have to make sure there's enough water and the temperature is all right. And I learned this recently from a friend of mine. He mentioned that yeast nutrients is actually dead yeast cells. So that's a little bonus knowledge there for you today. And if you found this video valuable, you can go ahead and share it with a friend. And don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.